Good morning. Welcome to our Bible study this morning. This morning we're looking at part number 2 in our series, But David Encouraged Himself in the Lord His God. This morning we'll be looking especially at Psalm 4, verses 1 through 8. Psalm 4, verses 1 through 8, if you would like to be turning. Please keep in mind this is number 2 in a 2-part series. In our previous part to this series, we looked at the background of what had taken place in David's life that led up to him writing Psalm number 4. What I would ask you to do is, if you would like a detailed look, and I think it would really help to understand our lesson this morning, if you take just a minute to review and to listen to part number 1, that'll help you to know exactly what David was going through when he wrote Psalm 4. That's very important to understand. But very quickly, let me just review what we looked at in part number 1 in a very quick review type of way. Listen to this in verse 6 of 1 Samuel 30. We were told that, and David was greatly distressed. Okay? So in our previous study, we saw that as David was ready to pen Psalm 4, we're told he was greatly distressed. The idea of distress there, to be greatly distressed, means to feel pressure on every side pushing down upon you. It's like somebody who goes into a cave that has real tight walls around it that only one person can fit into, and he squeezes himself into that cave and he can feel the walls of the cave hitting him on all sides. That's how David felt. He felt pressure from every side. He was greatly distressed. Here's some of the things that David was distressed about. The nation of Israel, being led by King Saul, was out to kill him. The other Gentile nations that were surrounding the city where he was living were out to get him and his men. The king of the Philistines was ready to learn about the lies that David had told to him, and therefore he was ready to be angry at David because one of his cities had been destroyed as the direct result of the actions of David and the lies that David had told. Both of David's wives had been taken by force by another Gentile nation, the Amalekites. David didn't know what had happened to them. He didn't know if they had been killed, if they were being abused, if they were enslaved. He didn't know what had happened to them. David's own men that had so faithfully supported him as he had run from King Saul, they now turned against him and were ready to stone him because they realized all of the sinful decisions that David had made that had led up to the destruction of the town in which they were living. Worst of all, David knew that he had sinned against his Lord. David understood that it was because of his sinful decisions he had made prior to what we read in 1 Samuel 30. That's what led to the horrible devastation of the city of Ziklag that we had read about in 1 Samuel 31 through 6. Let me just remind you very quickly, the idea is this. David, his men, and his families were living in the city of Ziklag. They had left to go out on military maneuvers. When they came back to the city, it had been overtaken and brought to ruins. All of their family members had been taken captive by the Amalekites. Again, if you want in detail why all of that took place, please listen to study number 1 in this series. We got into great detail why all of that took place. But we'll just leave it there for this morning. The idea is they have now come back to the city. They see the city in ruins. They know their family members had been taken, and they know it was directly David's fault for what's taken place. You can see why the Bible says David felt a tremendous amount of distress. He was greatly distressed. He was greatly pressured on every side. I'm sure it's like, somebody that doesn't like close places where they feel like they can't breathe when they get in a close place. You know, all that's the symbolic way that the Hebrew language is describing what David was going through. He felt pressure on every side. I'm sure he felt like he couldn't hardly even breathe and catch his breath. Everybody, it seemed like, was out to get him, and rightfully so, because he's the one that had made a series of sins committed that ended up putting him in this position that he was in. Okay. With that, David, most people believe, David sat down at this point in time in his life and wrote Psalm 4. So what I would like to do is look at Psalm 4, and in the context of Psalm 4, I would like us to remember, we're looking at how David handled this situation he was in. He felt like everybody was against him. He felt like he could do nothing right, and he realized it was his sin that led him into this situation. How did David handle that? What did David do when he felt all of these distresses and pressures upon him? Well, if you remember, right at the end of verse 6 of 1 Samuel 30, we were told, "But David encouraged himself in the Lord his God." Somehow David was able to find encouragement from the Lord, even in the midst of all these struggles. Folks, that's what we're looking at in Psalm 4. David now, as he sees this ruined city and he feels all of these distresses upon him, he sits down and he writes Psalm 4. And it's in this psalm that we get insight into how he encouraged his heart in the Lord. Let's begin in verse 1 of Psalm 4. To the chief musician on Neginoth, a psalm of David. This psalm was written by David. It was meant to be played on a stringed instrument called a Neginoth, and it was to be played during times of worship. So this was going to be a psalm that was sung in times of worship to worship and honor the Lord. So that gives us a hint as to what's going to be in the rest of the psalm. It's going to be a psalm of worship. It's going to be a psalm of honor to the Lord for what he had did for David when David was faced with this horrible situation. Listen to what David says. "Hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness." What does David do? First of all, step number one, if you feel like David felt, if you feel like everybody's out to get you, if you feel like you can do nothing right, if you realize that the problems you're facing in life are because of your sin, what are you to do? First of all, step one, look to the Lord. Notice what David says, "Hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness." David knew he had to look to the Lord because he could not deliver himself from this situation. David understood that the situation was so grave, no human could deliver him, no nation could deliver him, no king could deliver him. The only one that he could look to for help was the Lord himself. He goes on, "Thou hast enlarged me when I was in distress." Point number 2. David remembered all the times the Lord blessed him in the past. David remembered all the different times that he was faced with difficult situations, and he remembered how the Lord was able to deliver him and did deliver him. Obviously, the first one that probably comes to all of our mind is when he faced Goliath. Remember when David faced the giant Goliath? Seemed like an absolutely hopeless situation. And yet the Lord graciously delivered David when David was facing the greatest challenge of his life up to that point, to face the giant Goliath. The shepherd boy with the sling against the giant with the armor. And remember the end result? The Lord delivered David. Do you see how past victories in the Lord helps to encourage us in times of need now? Let me give you another example from the life of David. Before David faced Goliath, remember what he recalls in his mind? David thinks back before he faced Goliath, and he remembered a time when he was a shepherd boy out taking care of his sheep. And David remembers how a lion and a bear had come to attack his sheep at different times. David remembered how in each of those two instances the Lord delivered David and the sheep who were being attacked by the bear and the lion. The Lord gave David the grace to be able to kill both a lion and a bear to save his sheep. David used that to encourage him to go to war against Goliath. Now David is thinking back, and I'm sure a part of it is the victory over Goliath. He might have been thinking about the victory with the bear and the lion again. All we know is David was looking back at other times when the Lord delivered him mercifully from what seemed to be an overcoming enemy that David could not overcome from a human perspective. There's no way David could have killed a lion, a bear, or Goliath. And yet he was able to do all three because of the Lord's mercy and grace. Point number 3. Have mercy upon me and hear my prayer. David comes before the Lord humbly, realizing he has sinned, realizing he does not deserve deliverance, and realizing that the Lord, if he hears this prayer, it will be only by the Lord's grace and mercy. You can see David's humble attitude here when he comes before the Lord, asking the Lord to please hear his prayers. David realizes he made this bed that he's lying in now. David realized he can't claim innocence before the Lord and say, Lord, you know I'm the innocent one. No. David knew that basically he deserved what he was getting because of the bad, stupid, sinful choices he had made. Folks, the sad part is, how many times do we make bad, stupid, sinful choices in our life? If you're me, it's far too often. And when we see the Lord dealing in our life, and when we see the Lord allowing results of those sins to enter our life to teach us lessons, we realize what that feels like. To know that I'm facing this trial right now because of my own stupid, sinful decisions. That's how David felt. And he's coming before the Lord humbly, realizing the Lord had no obligation to hear him at all as he prayed, because David had sinned against his God repeatedly, getting him in the situation he was now in. Goes on. Verse 2, O ye sons of men, how long will you turn my glory into shame? Now, in verse number 1, David addressed the Lord in prayer. Beginning in verses 2 and 3, David now turns to those who are opposed to him. People like the Israelite army and Saul. People like the Philistines with Achish their king. Things like the Amalekites and the other Gentile nations are out to get David. David now addresses his tormentors, and here's what he says. O ye sons of men, how long will you turn my glory into shame? How long will you love vanity and seek after leasing? Selah. Do you notice how David is honest and recognizes the trials he's facing? Folks, many times when we're faced with severe trials, we have a tendency to want to candy coat them. We have a tendency to not really come face to face with what could take place because we try to fool ourselves. David doesn't hear. He recognizes the trials he's facing. He recognizes all the people that are out to get him. And instead of ignoring them or pretending like they don't exist, he addresses them face to face. He says, you tormentors, I realize you're out to get me. I'm not sugarcoating it. And I realize that you want to make me look as shameful as possible because I've done you wrong. I realize that. But he said, you know what? Human vengeance, just trying to get back at me for what I've done, is vain. It's vanity. It's worthless. You're not going to really accomplish anything by doing it. So David recognized the situation he was facing, and he was willing to personally address that situation. That's important for each one of us. When we're facing trials, acknowledge what those trials are. Hey, when you pray to the Lord, acknowledge that. Lord, look, I realize this is the condition I'm in. I can see all these things taking place in my life. I can see all these things that are opposing me. I realize I'm in a mess. And I realize I can't get myself out of this. He goes on in verse 3. But know that the Lord has set apart him that is godly for himself. Not only did David recognize the trials that he was facing, but here we find David recognized his special position in Christ. Can anything separate us from the love of the Lord? Now remember the long list that's given in Romans. It can distress, can peril, can famine, and it goes on and on. All the different trials that are possible to be faced in life, the point is this: they can't separate us from the love of our Lord. Even in David's sinful condition, and now I think he's probably dealt with his sin. Remember his humble attitude in verse 1. That leads me to believe that he has already repented of his sins now. But in either case, the point was this: David understood, even though he had greatly failed the Lord in times past, he understood that he still wasn't kicked out of God's family, for example. He realized that he still hadn't been removed from God's favor in the sense of his salvation. David understood that he still was a child of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. David understood that. And David understood that because he was still one of God's people, that there were still blessings to be had. He said, but know that the Lord has set apart him that is godly for himself. He said, look, God has separated me. The Lord has separated me to be used of him. Irregardless of what's taken place in my past, I now want to glorify my Lord and honor him. So you can come at me all you want. I want you to know it's vain. You can make me look as bad as you want. That's fine. You make me look bad. My concern isn't how I look anymore. It's how my Lord looks in all this. I want my Lord to be glorified. At the very end of verse 3, the Lord will hear when I call unto him. Again, you can see now David's assurance in his heart that he was what? He was still a part of God's family. He was assured that God was a merciful and forgiving God. He knew that the Lord wasn't going to hold those sins against him forever to the point he would never listen to his prayer again. He understood that he had been forgiven. He had come before the Lord humbly, asking the Lord to please hear his prayers because he had acknowledged what he had done against the Lord. And now he's saying, the Lord will hear when I call upon him. So he's telling the enemies, look, my Lord is not like your false gods that won't forgive. My Lord is not like your false gods that will demand a blood payment for when you sin against him. No. David says, my Lord is forgiving, my Lord is merciful. I know he's going to hear my prayers regardless of what I've done in the past. I know he'll hear me because he's a merciful, kind, loving, and forgiving Lord. So even though I was not faithful to him, he will still be faithful to me. Boy, what a blessing that is to know, folks. In times like that, when you know you failed the Lord and you know you've caused your own problems, what a blessing it is to know that the Lord will forgive. If you come before him humbly, he'll forgive those sins. He will intervene on your behalf. He will hear your prayers. Nothing can separate us from his love. Not even the sin that we commit. As a child of God, we're secure in his hands. Verse 4. Now David begins to address the worshipers. Now remember, David wrote this psalm with the intent of it being sung during worship services. Now he addresses the people who would be gathered together to worship, who would be singing this song. Listen to what he says now in verse 4. Stand in awe and sin not. David said, if there's one thing you should learn from this psalm and my experiences that led up to this psalm, it is what? Recognize the greatness of God and the need to live holy lives. He said, stand in awe of God, realizing after all the ways that I messed things up, after all the ways that I failed the Lord, after all the ways that I had really made a mess of things, He still was forgiving. He still was merciful. He still worked on my behalf. Stand in awe and realize how great that God is. But he said, then also realize the need to sin not. Learn from my mistakes and don't make the same mistakes as I did. Really, if you think about it, the majority of the sin that David committed during this whole sequence of events involved what? He panicked when he was under stress. King Saul and his armies were out to get him, so he panics. He runs to the Philistines. The Philistines give him refuge in Ziklag. He goes out attacking the Gentile cities, but so Achish doesn't find out, because I'm sure he was thinking that Achish would kick him out of the kingdom or maybe do worse. He panics and he lies about it. Then the story goes on. If you really study that story in detail, you'll find that was probably one of the greatest factors in the sins that David committed. He panicked. Instead of trusting the Lord and doing what was right, he chose to go against what the Lord wanted simply because he panicked. His faith was weak. He didn't trust in the Lord like he should in those situations. He tried to work things out his own way because he was scared. Again, I say, folks, how often does that happen in our lives? When we're faced with some type of a situation, we just panic. We don't stop and seek the Lord's will and then by faith do what he wants. We just do what we think is best at the time because the pressure is on. The only problem with that is, as you can see, what happens is the pressure doesn't decrease, it only increases when we take things in our own hands to the point we get so low there's no other place to look but the Lord because the pressure is so great we finally acknowledge we can't handle it. That's exactly what happened with David. You think about it. He starts under pressure thinking he can handle it. He gets into a worse and worse situation as he tries to handle the pressure till finally he gets to the point, I can't handle it anymore. Then he looks to the Lord. Stand in awe and sin not. Learn from his mistakes. Commune with your own heart upon your bed and be still. He doesn't say when the pressure is on, rush out and do everything you can to fix the situation yourself. David said, no, this is the lesson I want you to learn. When the pressure is on, stop. Meditate on the word of the Lord. Commune with your own heart. Examine your motives before you take an action. Examine, why you're doing it. What's the purpose behind it. What your goal is in doing it. Commune with your heart upon your bed and then be still. Don't be quick to take action in times of stress. Look to the Lord and seek his face. Offer the sacrifices of righteousness and put your trust in the Lord. What's the sacrifices of righteousness? Holy living. Remember in Romans it's described as being a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Sacrifices of righteousness. Live a holy life before him. Make sure that you're still putting the Lord first as you face these trials and struggles in life. Offer the sacrifice of righteousness and put your trust in the Lord. See, that's where David had failed in those two ways. He turned and committed outward acts of sin instead of being a living sacrifice to the Lord, performing only acts of holiness. How else did he fail the Lord? Instead of him trusting in the Lord, that the Lord knew what was right and the Lord would handle the situation, he trusted in himself, and he made all of those bad, sinful decisions that led to the mess that he was facing. Finally, in verses 6 through 8. In verses 6 through 8, David now once again addresses the Lord. There be many that say, who will show us any good? David said, Lord, I'm in a position where when people look at things, they're going to realize I've sinned against you. They're going to realize that I'm in a hopeless situation. Many people are going to look at this thing, and you know what they're going to say? It's hopeless, David. You've screwed up so bad it can never be remedied. There will be many that say, who will show us any good? David said, this is what I would like you to do for those people, dear Lord. Lord, lift up high, lift up the light of thy countenance upon us. He said, Lord, right now it's like it's nighttime out. It's as dark can be. There doesn't seem to be any end to it. And people are looking at this entire situation like it's nighttime. David, you stepped out too far. You've done too much. It's hopeless. David said, Lord, for those people, please be like the sun that rises in the morning. Show the light of your countenance, your appearance upon us. He says, show us that you're still present with us by allowing the light of your countenance to be shown upon us. He's saying, please don't turn your back on us. Please don't let us in this darkened state where it seems like it's impossible. No, Lord, you please rise like the morning sun, gradually showing light upon us, showing you're still with us, showing you still love us, showing you still care for us, and in doing so you'll silence those who say all hope is lost. He goes on, verse 7. Thou hast put gladness in my heart. Right there it is. David has experienced forgiveness. David has experienced God's mercy in his life. David recognizes he is still one of the Lord's. David recognizes all hope is not lost. David realizes no matter how tough the situation may seem, the Lord is able even when he's not. Thou hast put gladness in my heart more than in the time that their corn and their wine increase. Get this. David says, you know, in past times when people have been have experienced great times of earthly plenty and wealth, David says when the crops would come in as real good crops and when people would be enjoying your blessings multiplied upon them. David said, even though I'm facing all these difficulties right now, I want you to know I'm more joyful than people who have experienced your physical blessings to an overwhelming, overflowing measure. Okay, stop and think about why would it be that David's joy would be greater? Folks, it's one thing to experience the physical blessings of God, and it certainly gives us joy to do so. It's such a privilege and an honor to be taken care of physically by God, where you can see your financial needs being supplied. You can see, oh, your crops are coming in with a bumper harvest, that type of thing. But you know what's even brings greater joy to our life? Seeing the spiritual blessings of God. When we recognize that the Lord still loves us in spite of all that we've done, when we realize that God will forgive us no matter how grave the error might be, when we understand that the Lord will be with us every step of the way no matter what we may face in life, When those truths come into our heart, folks, that brings much greater joy than the greatest bumper crop there ever was. You could have a man that has been blessed, and I say has been blessed, with millions of dollars, and he will not be as joyful as the man who recognizes his sins have been forgiven and he is now secure for an eternity. That's what David was recognizing right now. He knew now the Lord had forgiven him in spite of all he had done. He realizes now there was hope because God was still with him. That meant more to him than all the riches this world had to offer. See, that's how great the Lord is. That's what a wonderful God that we serve. Look at verse 8. I will both lay me down in peace and sleep, for thou, Lord, only makest me dwell in safety. We started this psalm by saying that David was greatly distressed. We end this psalm by saying, I will both lay me down in peace and sleep. Doesn't sound like a man greatly distressed to me. Doesn't sound like a man that's distressed at all. How did he undergo such a great change? What took place? We've seen several stages where he humbled himself. He remembered how the Lord blessed him. The list goes on and on. Do you know what all of those things led up to? What all of those things culminated in? Look at the last part of verse 6. For thou, Lord, only makest me dwell in safety. Right there it is. How was this man who was greatly distressed now able to say, I lay me down in peace and sleep? How was David able to do that? He recognized it was the Lord only that could give him true safety. If he had only recognized that before he ran to the Philistines when King Saul and the Israelite army was after him. Think about what a difference it would have been. If he would have simply trusted in the Lord then, instead of running to the Philistines, you never would have had all these horrible things happen. But it was like a snowball. Once he started down that path of being scared instead of trusting in the Lord, once he started down the path of panicking instead of waiting on the Lord, you could see how things just got worse and worse and worse and worse till finally everything's in ruin. He lost the little that he had before when he started this. But now the Lord by his grace had brought David back to where David needed to be originally. So finally, if I can use the phrase, David had arrived. He finally had within him the spirit and the attitude he should have in him. It is the spirit and the attitude of knowing he is safe in the hands of the Lord no matter who may oppose him, no matter what he may face, he is safe in the hands of the Lord. Folks, what a blessing that is to come to that truth. What a blessing it is to acknowledge the fact that we understand the Lord will take care of us no matter what this life may hold for us. Folks, that's how in the midst of such strife and such sorrow and such heartache, David was able to encourage himself in the Lord his God. The next time we, especially as the children of the Lord, the next time that we face these type of situations in our life, folks, please remember, we can do just as David did. By handling these situations properly and by looking to the Lord, he can give us the peace and he can give us the comfort that we need to face any situation in life, because we know we're one of the Lord's and nothing can separate us from him. Thank you, folks, for joining me in this study. May the Lord bless you as you study his word.